Hello, it's Cavernhead. This video will be part of my game ideas series. I'm a small game developer. I currently just made one market available game called Partial Control, which took me far too long. I often dream of making all these crazy games. I figure there's very little chance I get to make them all in my lifetime, so I might as well share my ideas and talk about them since I actually enjoy that quite a lot. So this game I'm going to talk about in this video is called Cave Organ. I'll give a sort of general picture of how the entire game will work without going too much into detail, since I haven't thought of all the details and also a lot of things should probably be decided through prototyping. So Cave Organ is a massive multiplayer online game, something a bit like World of Warcraft, Dofus, or EVE Online. There are hundreds. All the players will be in a massive world that is divided in multiple servers. Here is a map of the world of the game. The game happens in a strange biome composed of underground forests connected by caves. There's no complex character-driven story. The game is just about strange mysterious forms of life that evolve within the cave. Generally speaking, the game is for players that tend to prefer gameplay-oriented games over storyline-driven games. I'm not sure if it's so clear. The forests in the picture are pink. Each forest in the game will be a separate server. This is handy since as players travel through the cave passages that link the forest servers, the servers can be loaded. Here is a forest that represents an entire server. Since the whole game happens inside caves, this helps justify stylized graphics that are representative of a form of night vision. Every tree in the forest will be a key position and will play an important role on how the game works. Players play as varied creatures. Creatures will always be on trees. All creatures have some sort of method they use to travel from tree to tree. It can be jumping, flying, or just passing through the ground. Players have a third-person view of their creature. They can zoom in and out pretty far from their creature and see the entire forest if they want. At all times, players can chat via chat box with all other players nearby in the forest. Let's take a closer look at what the creatures the players control are up to in the forest. To progress in the game, players need to eat insects from the trees. They do this by digging a hole into the tree and sticking their mouth inside. Eating from inside trees is the official grinding XP method of the game. This is the PvE part. Inside every tree there is a small biome of insects crawling around. All creatures are able to eat from inside trees and have different properties that make them better at eating different types of insects. The player can use his creature's tongue to pull insects from inside the tree into his stomach. He has pretty good control of his creature's tongue. Eating insects from the trees is an entire small game and the simulation of insects is extremely varied. In this part of the game the player sees a constant flow of little insects constantly moving around, doing all sorts of things. If the player wants, he can be attentive and look at what the insects are up to. At any time there could be a rare insect that passes by for which the player needs to perform a more complex tongue maneuver to eat. There are also many other things the player can do to intervene within the insect biome. I'll go into more details in just a while. Most creatures players control will have predators. As a player is eating insects, they could get attacked by another player. When this happens, they could choose to fight back or run away. At this point, the player and his predator will be jumping around from tree to tree, hitting each other every now and then. I'll get more details on how these fights will happen a bit later. Let's see more details about the eating insect part of the game. This part of the game is extremely important. It's designed to keep the player in the game for as long as possible without it being boring. For this part, the design will be geared towards giving the player the choice on how much effort they want to put into their play session. The player will either be able to progress without thinking, or they could put some or a lot of effort and progress faster. At different moments, the players will want to put a different amount of effort. If the game doesn't let them, then they will want to stop playing. For players to be able to put a lot of time in the game, they need to be able to play in easy mode, else they will get tired, but at the same time they need to have the possibility to face a harder challenge. If they can't, they will find the game boring and quit, so that's the way the eating insects / grinding of the game will be geared. The first part of eating insects from trees involves finding a spot on the tree to eat from. Each creature can listen to the noises inside the tree and know more or less what is inside the tree before digging a hole. Some creatures have a better hearing than others. When a player finds a good spot, they need to dig a hole in the tree. Each creature has a different quality at digging holes into trees that affects how fast they dig. When a player finishes a hole, he can stick out his tongue inside the tree. The tongue has a limited range it can reach. The player has a reserve stomach represented in his HUD. Whenever the player picks up an insect with his tongue, he swallows it and puts it in his reserve stomach, and then he can transform it into organic material. The reserve stomach is essentially the player's inventory. The player can spit out insects or organic material from his reserve stomach and put them back into the tree whenever he wants. This is an essential mechanic for the player to be efficient at finding insects. For example, whenever a specific resource-rich insect passes by, the player may need to spit out a lure insect to attract the resource-rich insect towards his tongue. As time passes, the player gets hungry, so they need to transfer organic material from their reserve stomach to their digestion stomach to avoid losing lives from hunger. The player can also combine organic material inside their reserve stomach to create different organic elements. This is more or less the equivalent of crafting in games. Combining organic material is also really important in the game. The player can use combined elements to affect the insect biome inside trees in many different ways. It can be to lure insects, it can be to feed insects and get them to grow, it can be to get insects to fight each other, and many other things. But ultimately, the reason the player extracts insects from the tree is to gather the biomaterial they need for upgrading their creature or creating special superfoods, which I'll talk about later. A while ago I made a video on a prototype about a game filled with small creatures. This gives a bit the general feeling that this biome of insects inside the trees would have. I put a link in the description. But aside from using organic material to pick up more insects, the player can use organic material to upgrade his attributes. He does this by eating combinations of types of organic material. For example, eating organic material of type B, A and X makes his creature faster. I should specify that by eating I mean actually swallowing the organic material from the reserve stomach to the digestion stomach. With upgrades, players get stronger and stronger. Eventually they reach a limit. At this point it's time for them to evolve into a new creature. To evolve, players need to eat special insects that allow them to initiate the evolution. When players evolve into a new creature, they start again with 0 upgrades. With the organic material in the player's reserve stomach, they can also craft special foods that when they eat will give them momentary bonuses. I call these superfoods. These superfoods will mainly be useful in player versus player fights. They will give players bonuses like extra speed, more damage, more armor, etc. The player can also obtain through organic crafting some very special items called nutrition sacks. Every player has a limited amount of nutrition sacks. Higher level players that have gone through more evolutions can have more nutrition sacks. Nutrition sacks are simply storage locations players can use to store insects and organic materials they collected. These are crucial for PvP. Players sort of build their empire by placing nutrition sacks all over the server and choosing carefully what items they place in them. Trees within a server or between different servers have tendencies to contain different types of insects. Different insects attract different players that have different objectives. Therefore, properly placing items where needed is crucial for trading or PvP. Players can trade organic items with each other, but these are primitive trades, meaning there's no money. There won't be a centralized market system which allows players to easily find trades of specific merchandise. Instead, the game will have a system in which there will be a limited amount of items that will be specially designed to be traded. Therefore, because only a limited amount of items will be traded, it won't be hard for a player to find another player that trades an item they want. The trade value of these items will be constantly fluctuating within regions due to the nature of the events that happen in the game. Also, trading will be highly influenced by who controls what creature. Some creatures the players control can't trade with others, and other creatures will have special trading relations with others. Something that will help these key trading items to be constantly in demand is that they will expire over time. Since like everything, they are organic, it makes perfect sense. Here is an example of what some of the creatures in the game might look like, and which creature evolves into what other creature. All creatures will resemble each other in a few ways. They can somehow climb on trees, travel from tree to tree, and they have some way they can eat insects from trees. All creatures will also have different relations to each other that will influence how players interact with each other. For example, predator-prey relation, trading relations, and hunting-pack relations. These 8 creatures we see in this picture form together the basic evolution tree. I'll give more explanations on that later. Let's look a bit at the creatures in the basic evolution tree. It all starts with the necrocyte larva. The necrocyte larvae are very different to normal creatures. Instead of moving outside of trees, they move within the tunnels in the trees with the insects. Necrocyte larvae also don't eat as many insects as other creatures. Instead, they eat the dead bodies of bigger creatures killed during PvP. This is an interesting, fun concept, and it also helps initiate new players to the game. Since new players will need to observe the better players to know when there's going to be dead bodies that they can feed on, they will learn about the game by observing what the better players do. The next evolution after the necrocyte larva is the weta. Weta eat necrocyte larva and other insects. They don't have a tongue, so they need to get inside the tree to eat insects, but they can only spend a limited amount of time inside the trees. So they also spend a reasonable amount of time outside trees. In the next evolution, the player has a choice. Either he goes for the slow, very defensive Venom Stag, or he goes for the Toucan Monkey, that is fast but fragile. At this point, every new evolution the player will have a choice between two creatures with interesting differences. I won't go into all the details on the rest of the creatures. Something that does interest us is how the game manages to keep things balanced amongst the creatures. We need the players to be constantly increasing their power and getting stronger and stronger, yet we still want the higher level players to interact with the lower level players, because we want to increase as much as possible the player interaction. So let's see how we can get this to happen. First, there will be a basic evolution tree of creatures we saw before. The creatures from the basic tree have relations to each other. For example, one creature might be predator to another creature might be good at trading with two others. The game design focuses on making sure things are balanced with all creatures in the basic evolution tree, and that the players that use all the types of creatures manage to feel included. There are only 8 creatures. I don't think it's impossible for the design to manage this. So what happens when players reached the end of the standard evolution tree? The next evolution will turn them into a special type of creature represented in the diagram with red. These are the apex creatures. These apex creatures always get stronger and stronger as the players climb up the evolution tree. This is the evolution the player is looking forward to as they progress. Apex creatures will generally only quarrel against other apex creatures. They will all be able to eat each other, but they won't be able to eat players that aren't playing apex creatures unless the players attack them. Multiple low non-apex creatures can gather to try to kill one apex creature, but they need to know what they're doing. Apex creatures will be very powerful. Okay, so then you might think that higher level players won't interact with lower level players. Yes, they won't interact that much with lower level players as long as they play with apex creatures. But if they want to evolve into stronger apex level creatures, they first need to get past a few weaker evolutions. For example, a player that evolves past his apex creature will become a weta once again, but this time the weta will be weaker than the first weta. The player will have to evolve 3 more times, passing through an evolution tree similar to the basic evolution tree, just this time the creatures are weaker. While the players pass through the evolution tree of weaker creatures, they can always use special organic items to transform momentarily back to their highest apex creature evolution. However, these organic items may not be easy to craft. Transforming back to an apex creature will not be a defensive PvP strategy. It will just allow players to go back and progress within their apex creature objectives, which are different. I'll talk about them a bit later. Whilst playing with weaker creatures, higher level players conserve the advantage of having more nutrition sacks around the map, but have to manage using weaker creatures. Basically, they will have the opportunity to use more tactics rather than brute strength. The baseline evolution tree is the point of reference for all interactions between creatures, meaning that whether a player is a low level toucan monkey or a high level weaker toucan monkey, their role will be the same. They will be the prey of carno plants and slith crocs. Essentially, as players progress, they become weaker than stronger, then even weaker than even stronger. This graph shows the power level of players as they evolve their creatures. As a higher level player dying because of a new player isn't such a big shame, because players are well aware they control weaker creatures. The game puts a lot of emphasis on it. So with this system, players at all times are more or less even and constantly interacting. The only moment when players may face each other in a really uneven way is when they play as apex creatures. As an apex creature, a player's goal will be very different. Success at defeating other apex players will allow them to claim territory that belong to the defeated players. When a player owns territory, they can change rules of the game that affect all players that enter that territory. A territory could just be one tree or more. Players owning territory must choose a moment in the day when their territory can be challenged by other players. At that moment, the players defending their territory will be able to go back to their last apex evolution to defend it. Players that control too much territory will need to be skilled and have powerful apex creatures, else they will not be able to defend their territory. Players will be able to upgrade their last apex creature evolution while they play as normal creatures, allowing them to put more of their heart and soul into their apex creatures. When an apex creature kills another, they will not be able to actually eat their dead body, so the body will just remain where they died, available for all normal creatures to eat. For normal creatures, eating the bodies of apex creatures will be very profitable, so there might be more than just one creature fighting over a dead body. Unlike most MMOs, Cave Organ doesn't have any system for players to form long-lasting groups. The concept is about savage animals, and in the wild, it's everyone for themselves, only the fittest survive. To avoid players forming alliances, the game has two systems. The first is that, as we already talked about, players evolve into different creatures. Every creature has natural allies and enemies. This doesn't make long alliances between players easy, since often they will have members of their alliance be their prey or predator. Then the second thing is the players that are using creatures that are made to hunt in packs will not be able to hunt forever with the same people, because their creature will start to get negative emotions when hanging around the same people for too long. When creatures have too many negative emotions, they start to become useless. They may even take damage. Negative emotions is something the players will get when they violate any of their natural behaviors. For example, they will get negative emotions if they don't try to eat their prey and let them live. Despite such a focus on avoiding players forming solid, long-lasting groups, the game is still intended to be a very social game. Since we got rid of player groups, players are not gifting each other free things, and most importantly, they don't have their group leaders do their negotiations for them. Players in Cave Organ will need to interact with each other and negotiate very frequently to be successful. No deal will last too long, and due to the fluctuating nature of natural relations between different creatures, every day things will be different. One day the server will be filled with predators and you will need to make trades with nearby players to survive. Another day you will be joining a small group of predators that, after some successful hunts, has to deal with a small civil dispute. When two players talk, it will usually be because they want something from each other, and that's the beauty about this game. Okay, so now let's talk about the PvP. So the main skill the players will need during the fights is quick smart decision making. The game won't be about spamming buttons or super reflexes. The action in the game will happen within defined phases that last between 2 and 8 seconds each, in which both players need to simultaneously make decisions. I won't go into all the details, but here are some of the things that will be important during the fights in order. First is player intention, of course. When another player gets near you in the game, the most important question will be, what do they want from me? Do they want to eat me? Do they want to steal my tree? Or maybe do they want to trade or my alliance? Observing and communicating with players will be crucial during this part of the game. Just after, when players know each other's intentions, if they are hostile towards each other, this is when the fight really starts. For this part, the most important things will be the player position, momentary bonuses, and nutrition sacks. By position, I mean which tree each player is on. The picture here shows a top view of the forest in a server. We can see that player 2 is the prey attempting to run away from player 1. Player 1 and player 2 are one tree away from each other. The distance is short. Player 2 needs to run away towards his nutrition sacks because this is the place where he will be able to benefit from the most resources. During the fights, there will be small skirmishes as well as periods of waiting in which both players go back to eating from trees whilst simultaneously watching each other's moves. During the chase and small skirmishes, the players will be choosing when and which momentary bonuses to use. For example, in the picture scenario, player 1 might want to use a speed bonus to catch up to player 2, but this might not have been a good choice if player 2 was further away. The fights may last minutes or maybe hours. If a player wishes to log out, he will not be able to do so straight away. If he is in a hostile situation, he will need to initiate the logout, then wait something like 5 minutes before he can safely log out. Now, the least important thing in PvP, is still very important, will be the natural attributes that the players can increase via upgrades, such as jump distance, recuperation speed between jumps, defense, lives, armor. Natural attributes will tilt the fight between two creatures towards one or the other, but skilled players should be able to defeat players with better natural attributes. Now let's talk about player death and reward for eating players. We might be tempted to encourage fights by giving high reward for eating players and low punishment for dying, but this causes a problem. Players can exploit the fact that eating players produces a net positive of general resource increased amongst the general player community. They can do this by letting each other be eaten, which sort of ruins the competitive side of the game for everyone. So here's how things will work in this game. As I previously talked about, players will pass through evolutions. Between each evolution, there will be attribute upgrades. When a player dies, he will lose all his attribute upgrades and respawn at his current evolution with 0 attribute upgrades. This will be a setback, but with no challenge, there's no fun. When a player reaches an evolution, he won't be able to go down the evolution tree, so slowly all players will only be climbing up. The reward for eating a player will increase proportionally to how many attributes that player had, meaning that it will be useless to eat players that just recently evolved into new creatures. So players should normally want to wait to eat others until they have at least a few upgrades. This system should make things nice and tense, and as a player is getting more and more attribute upgrades, they become a juicier target, and dying after nearly reaching the next evolution puts the player a long way down. Each time a player evolves will be a small moment of celebration for them. Also, an important detail, eating a player that is a lot lower in the evolution tree comparing to you won't be as profitable as eating a player higher or slightly less evolved than you. This is to avoid the issue of experienced players using newly created accounts to help their weaker level creatures evolve. If the game is successful, I would imagine probably people would start to get bored of the basic creature evolution tree. So it will need regular updates and new content. So that was a small overview of the entire game idea. I would be very curious to see how a game like this would turn out. The main thing I like about the idea is that as a player you're able to constantly be negotiating with players around you. Most MMOs have a solid state of equilibrium. The relations between players only change rarely, and it's usually only the relations between player groups that matter. This game pushes for a constant change in all the elements of player relations, making every playing session feel more varied and somewhat a bit like playing a more relaxed version of the board game Risk. I'm not sure if all the design choices would work as well as I would want them to. Some things would probably have to be changed at the prototyping stage. There are many things hard to predict for a game like this. Let's say a group of 7 people were to work on making this game. 3 programmers, 1 3D artist, 1 animator, 1 designer, and finally 1 person to deal with the random stuff like social media or mass testing. I would roughly estimate it would be finished in around 3 years. The idea is a bit ambitious because the game is an MMO after all, which implies a lot of balancing and prototyping. But there is no big technical hard parts, especially if the quantity of players is limited within servers. Then also, the way I see the graphics, they would be very simplistic. I wouldn't want the game to waste a lot of space in the hard drive and have long loading screens. I guess this would be a lightweight MMO. Maybe it's something some people might want. Well, thanks for watching.